If you worship a God who divides human beings into my people and not my people, you have to justify that kind of xenophobic thinking, and you will start thinking in the same way yourself. If you have a God who is a misogynist, you will have to become a misogynist. If you have a God who can invade other people's countries and slaughter them just because they're not my people, well, now you can justify wars in the name of that God, which is exactly what we have done through the ages. So for me, that's one of the reasons why it's important to separate the idea of God from these stories of violence and colonization. And it's not a matter of preference. You go to the root meanings of the words, it becomes crystal clear. These are actions of non-human entities interfering in Project Earth in the deep past. Actions which left a scar on our psyche so profound that you can hear the story repeated in cultures all around the world.
Paul Anthony Wallis, welcome on Just Tap In. What are you most excited about right now in your life?
Oh my goodness, there's so much happening in 2024 for me. New seasons for the family, which is very exciting, with 3 young children, all getting into new things. Very exciting project I'm involved in with Matt LaCroix, which would take us around the world to look at some sites that have not been correlated before and plumb some ancient wisdom. I'm very excited about that. My new book, The Invasion of Eden, is coming out in April. I'm excited about that because so much has happened in the last 12 months to put the question of contact with other civilizations out there for general consumption and general conversation. So I feel there's a lot happening right now. And of course, as I continue my research path, lots of new connections with people, including you good self, Emilio. And thank you for having me today.
Thank you, brother. One thing that you've come across in all of your study of ancient texts is that Earth is essentially a project. And I would love to begin by having a snapshot of the development of this project on Earth that has been going on since, the ancient Sumerians have told us, to really where we are now. What is this development of the project of Earth really begin, and where are we seeing it develop and evolve into the future?
Oh, that's a great question, and a very profound question. Yes, I have got in the habit of speaking about Project Earth because as I discover paleocontact narratives in indigenous story and in the Bible and other ancient texts, the picture that emerges is that planet Earth has a lot of stakeholders involved. I mean, you and I, going through the school system, will have grown up in an empty cosmos where planet Earth is really only our business. But I've learned through my studies that we've had the interest of cosmic neighbors for a very, very long time. So if we go to ancient Greek thought, for instance, to the work of Plato, which then seeds much of what's in the New Testament and forms Christianity, we have the Greek idea of the craftsman or the demiurge. And that represented a being that was not from Earth, but was a very advanced kind of being who came and did terraforming on the planet to get it to its familiar form. So Project Earth isn't just about managing human society, it's a stakeholding in the planet itself. And that Greek story repeats around the world. You can listen to Iroquois story. You can listen to the story told by the Yoruba and Edo people of Nigeria, Benin, Cameroon. They talk about Osanabua and the sons of Osanabua terraforming the planet. We can listen to Zulu story, the story of Unkulunkulu, and we've got the story of the planet being populated with life forms that were already developed. And so the ancient Zulu story is not that life evolved on Earth, it evolved somewhere else, and then it was released onto Earth. So the idea that Earth is a project is an idea shared by cultures all around the world. It's not just about human beings. It's about the other flora and fauna and the planet itself. And as to what the project is about and where it's headed, I think that picture becomes more and more complex the further we go through history. And when we read some of the ancient stories, it can sound fairly simple, as if we've got 2 or 3 external demographics involved in shaping the progress of Earth. Now I think it's far more than 2 or 3. So in 2020, when Hayam Hashed, the Brigadier General who for 28 years was Israel's Chief of Space Security, he stepped forward and talked about our being in contact for more than 7 decades with what he called a galactic federation, indicating that there are lots of demographics involved. In 2008, I think it was, when Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, the Russian Prime Minister, was caught on a live microphone talking to a journalist, he said that every new Prime Minister of Russia, when they come into office, is given a dossier detailing all the civilizations we're already in contact with. And the journalist said, "How many?" And he said, "Oh, I wouldn't like to say because I don't want to panic people." So I think it's a lot. I think there are a lot of agendas for planet Earth. Some of our ancient stories talk about colonization. Some talk about beings coming here to hybridize with us because they want to improve their own gene pool. Some talk about beings who come here for very prosaic 3D reasons, mining the planet, getting what they can from the planet. If we go to the ancient Sumerian stories, it's simply that we're a staging post to provide a strategic foothold in this part of the galaxy. So I think there are a lot of agendas involved in Project Earth. I'm interested in the human agenda, which is to have the best experience that we can have, to learn as much as we can, to become as intelligent and conscious as we can. I do think there's something very special about planet Earth and Project Humanity that gives us an appeal to our cosmic company. I think the reason we have a lot of interest here is because there is something unique and special about our planet and about Homo sapiens.
And we're almost just beginning to scratch the surface of what really is the potential of humanity. You even mentioned the savant syndrome, when people have a brain injury and all of a sudden they're downloading languages that they had never spoken before. But before we get into the real potential of humanity, I would love to start off in your area of expertise. For 33 years in church ministry, you had to give sermons about the Bible and interpret the text through your hermeneutics. All of a sudden you were coming across these texts and you were saying, but something else is going on. There's all these pluralized verbs and all these things going on, but they're essentially using the same word for everything. So what was really going on here with our interpretation of these biblical texts?
Yes, that's right. That's what got me into the field of paleocontact. It was through engaging with the Bible as a preacher and as a theological educator. And as an educator, I trained pastors in how to interpret ancient texts, the texts of the Bible in particular. And so we would look at the sources. We'd ask the question, is this the original form of the story, or is it an adaptation of an earlier story? And if it differs from the earlier story, how does it differ? Why does it differ? And then we would look at form analysis. What kind of literature is this? Is this memory? Is this an analogy? Is this some kind of a sermon that we're reading? And then the fundamental question, what do the words mean? And this is what you were just hinting at, Emilio. Some of the words do not mean what we think they do. We're very familiar with the traditional translations. So we're familiar with seeing the word God throughout the text or the Lord throughout the text. But once you get to the Greek and the Hebrew of the Bible, you realize that the key words do not hold those familiar meanings. So the oldest word the Bible translates as God is the word Elohim, which is a masculine plural word. Not only is the word plural, but it carries plural verbs and exhibits plural behaviors. And so that's why you have this strange phrase, let us make the humans to look like one of us. And we don't want the humans to be too much like one of us. Well, one of whom? One of the powerful ones. That's what the Elohim means. And so in my first book of Paleocontact, Escaping from Eden, I asked the question, what happens if we leave that word untranslated or we use the root meaning, which is powerful ones? How do the stories change? And they do change, but they don't change in a random way. Once you read them in that more fundamental way, they line up with the source narratives from out of ancient Sumeria, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria. And the red pill for me was seeing that the Bible's Elohim stories, far from being God's stories, were summaries of the Sumerian stories of sky people. And of course, we use a different word for sky people today, and it's extraterrestrials. So you then have to ask the next question, what is the logic of our stories of God being based on someone else's stories about extraterrestrials? So that's where Escaping from Eden starts. But there are more key words that are waving red flags at us than just Elohim. When you read the word the Lord, it's often rendering the word Yahweh, which is a word with no Hebrew etymology at all. It has no Hebrew meaning, ultimately, the further you go back. And some Hebrew scholars, I think Emmanuel Tov of the University in Jerusalem, Hebrew University in Jerusalem, argues that it is a sequence of sounds. And that's the belief I've come to. It's a sequence of sounds which you can find in other ancestral narratives all around the world. At best, it's a loan word from another culture. So you have to put a question mark over that word. And if ever you come across the Lord Almighty, it is not what we think it is. If you go to one of the most authoritative Hebrew lexicons in the world, which is the Brown Drivers Briggs, it will tell you that that is an invented translation. If you go to the New Jerusalem Bible, which is one of my favorites, the senior editor of that really helped me in my research path for Escaping from Eden. The editorial notes there say that the Almighty the meaning of it is uncertain. And you get into the root meanings, and it turns out it means the powerful one, the destroyer. And so we've got this sequence of sounds. We've got the powerful ones, the powerful one, the destroyer. Yahweh, which people have become used to associating with the idea of God, actually turns out to be a junior Elohim under the charge of a being called El Elyon. And then you get into Genesis 6, and there's a second wave of arrivals of the B'nai Elohim, the sons of the powerful ones, which I argue means the ones like the powerful ones. They're the ones who come and do the hybridizing. And bit by bit, you realize that there is this community of strange, anomalous beings washing around in the text. They arrive en masse as something the Bible calls the Tzeva Hashemayim, the armies of the sky. And then they form what the Bible calls the El Ba'adat, the council of power. And we hear something about the conversations of that council as the stories of the Bible progresses. So once I'd probed all those words, it really became impossible to go back and read the stories the old way as stories of God. And in some ways that was a great relief, because like most preachers, I'd come across plenty of behavior by the God character or the Yahweh character that did not really line up with anything I believed about God based on the teachings of Jesus. If I look at the divine qualities listed by Jesus and those who wrote for him, I don't find the kind of unforgiving, violent brutality exhibited by many of these characters purporting to be God in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures. And so like many preachers and believers, I've come across these anomalies, this just outrageously appalling behavior, and thought, there must be something more to that story. That can't quite be right. Must get back to that at some point. But like many pastors, I was simply so overscheduled for years on end that it took me a long time before I finally did sit down and follow the white rabbit into this rabbit warren and realize many of these stories are not God's stories at all. They are the Hebrew version of stories of invading sky people who colonized us and governed us with brutalism. And as long as we confuse that kind of activity with the activity of God, we are putting ourselves in a household where we're having to tiptoe around for fear of offending the Almighty. And if we do offend the Almighty, then we've got an eternity of torment to look forward to. You know, a lot of believers know there's something off with that story. And in my Eden series, I show what it is that's off. And it's a huge relief to realize, no, the Bible is not what we thought it was. It is a canon of paleocontact. And I think in the Hebrew scriptures, one of the most precious troves of cultural memory of contact that we have on the planet.
Fascinating stuff. And staying on Yahweh really, really quick for a moment, you said that it is a sequence of sounds. And I also heard that it is almost like an invocation of sounds that was known to our ancestors and that is deeply ingrained in our subconscious, these sounds. So if you want to sort of touch upon what are these sounds invoking when we say the name Yahweh, and what do they mean to our ancestors?
Well, if we start off on a world tour of our ancestors' stories about the deep past, we will find a pattern of story that recurs everywhere. And we know it as dragon story. So it's the story of a time when our ancestors were ruled over by entities that were not human, that had no fellow feeling with us, and that governed through terror and through overwhelming power. And if I give you some of the names of these draconian entities who ruled over us: Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl, Cucumats, Kolkis, Akek, Koka, Kuchedra, Kuchu, Kur. In Wales, the Draig Koch. You might notice something about all those names. They've all got this k in them, or a h. And the shape of dragon story is very interesting. There are two families of dragon stories, and the more ancient one is of dragons who came and terraformed planet Earth. So there's that terraforming story again, because they took pity on human beings living on a planet that had been devastated by something. And then there's a second wave of dragon story, which Julien Duy is the expert on this from the Sorbonne in Paris. And he argues for the second wave, which I would date to about 10,000 years ago, where the dragons come and then they run things, and they're violent and terrifying. And we now work for them. We have to keep them supplied with beef, lamb, gold, and virgin girls. That's the whole purpose of our existence. Except in that family of stories, that goes on for so long that the human beings become weary of working for these superiors who have no interest in them. And terror gets used to such an extent that it finally loses all traction. And the people finally say, we need to act together to get rid of the dragon. If we come together and speak with one voice and say we'll no longer serve the dragon, what can it do? Not going to kill us all, is it? It might kill some of us. And by the time you're saying, oh, what can they do? They can only kill us. Your despair has flipped into a kind of courage. And so then the people come together and they get rid of their dragon by confronting it. In some stories, it's a prince who spears it or beheads it or this, that, or the other. But that's the pattern of the story all around the world. And there are early stories carrying the name of Yahweh that follow exactly that shape. So we're given physical descriptions of Yahweh which sound very draconian, talking about the length of his snout, the strength of his hide, his flight feathers, the length of his tail, how he can ignite his breath and incinerate people. I mean, this sounds rather like a dragon. And then we get to 1 Samuel 8, and he's gotten rid of. The people won't serve him any longer. So it's following that story arc. And you might say, yes, but where's the sequence of sounds? Yahweh doesn't sound anything like the other figures in the dragon stories. Not now he doesn't, because now we say Yahweh, but those 2 H's haven't always been silent. They followed a pattern very common in language around the world, a pattern of sound softening called affrication. And so, you know, a B becomes a V, or a V becomes a W, or a P becomes a F, or a T becomes a Ts, becomes a S, so on and so forth. So you go further back in time to Proto-Northwest Semitic, the ancestor of Hebrew, and the 2 H's sound like this. It's exactly the same sequence of sounds associated with dragon story all around the world. Now, people might take this figuratively. They might say, well, maybe this wasn't a literal dragon. This is just a way of talking about other powers or draconian powers in sense of the use of terror. But the story follows the same shape in terms of social progress, that it's a story about people discovering the power of grassroots solidarity to affect change. We've seen that in our recent history. If we look at the history of the Philippines, if we look at what happened to the Ceausescus, if we listen to the period of history that led to the release of Nelson Mandela, they were massive grassroots actions that created political change at the top. And that's the real take home of Dragon Story. Although I can't help thinking all those physical descriptions might be telling something other than poetry.
And it's that power of the collective when people come together to fight this force. This brings us to the story of the Tower of Babel, which they were telling us that it was meant to unite people, and then it was destroyed to confuse and change the languages so we wouldn't be able to speak to each other. I heard you say that the Tower of Babel was a Stargate, which led us to rapid access to space stations. So do you mind walking us through that story of the Tower of Babel, what it was really used for, and how we can use that story to unite the people again?
So in the Bible, the story of the Tower of Babel is one of those anomalies. It's a story that doesn't quite make sense as we have it. So first of all, we go to Babel and we're told by the current translation that God is offended because the people living on the Shinar plain have breached zoning laws. They built a building too tall, and that's why their culture must be obliterated. And when I say obliterated, we need to clarify what happens at Babel, because the way the story is told, we often picture it that we begin with one people group all speaking the same language, and they built this tower, and then when God attacks them, what changes is that some are now speaking Spanish, some are now speaking English, some are speaking French, and they can't understand each other. That is not what the story says. It is not about the development of languages. It's about the loss of language. The people cannot understand each other anymore. They can't communicate verbally. They can't process verbally. This is more akin to a neurological attack than the development of beautiful languages. It is so profound that the society disintegrates. That doesn't happen when you've got Spanish people living next to French people, living next to Italian people, who, if they work really hard, can probably work out what the other one is saying.
And now we have AI, we can auto-translate anything.
Now we've got Google Translate, that's right. So what actually happened is that the society has been attacked to the extent that it cannot function any longer. They are, in a sense, bombed back into a pre-Stone Age condition. So that's an anomaly. Really? God does that for building a building too tall? let's look more closely. What's the purpose of that building again? It was to reach the heavens. What does that mean? When we're listening to the story of a culture, that when it says the heavens, that's its word for sky. That's its word for outer space. The purpose of this structure was to reach outer space, we could say. That's a perfectly fair translation. Let's look again at what Babel means. It's the gateway of the power. It's the power gate. So you might begin to wonder if something else is going on, but as soon as you read it alongside the Enuma Elish, the Sumerian source narrative, you'll get some other detail confirming your suspicions. Because from the Shinar plain, from the Tower of Babel, as we find it in the Sumerian Enuma Elish, we're told that 50 technicians dispatch, I think it's 300 observers to their stations in the stars. So you put that story together, and quite clearly the power gate is a stargate. Its function is to send people to their stations in the stars, or to use the Bible's language, to reach the heavens. So what we have is a society that is building spacefaring technology, and some neighbors are saying, we don't want a spacefaring planet Earth, bomb them. And it would be akin to, without naming names, certain world powers bombing airstrips in other people's countries so that their strategic enemies don't have a staging post from which they can launch an attack. It's that kind of story. We don't want a spacefaring planet Earth. So who are the beings who do this bombing? Well, in the story, we've got this plural conversation going on, and we've got the names Yahweh, Elohim. Once again, it's telling us a plurality of powerful beings had this conversation and took this action. Now, we have turned it into a God story, and it's just one of many where we see something absolutely brutal and horrific. I mean, imagine us effecting that kind of neurological attack on another country. It would be a crime against humanity. But the way we translate it, God can go around doing that kind of thing, and we're expected to worship him. And so that's why I think it's very important to disentangle this, because if you worship a monster, you'll become a monster. If you worship a God who divides human beings into my people and not my people, you have to justify that kind of xenophobic thinking, and you will start thinking in the same way yourself. If you have a God who is a misogynist, you will have to become a misogynist. If you have a God who can invade other people's countries and slaughter them just because they're not my people, well, now you can justify wars in the name of that God, which is exactly what we have done through the ages. So for me, that's one of the reasons why it's important to separate the idea of God from these stories of violence and colonization. And it's not a matter of preference. You go to the root meanings of the words, it becomes crystal clear. These are actions of non-human entities interfering in Project Earth in the deep past. Actions which left a scar on our psyche so profound that you can hear the story repeated in cultures all around the world.
And I know a man that really influenced you in your work, Carl Sagan, the astrophysicist. I found a quote of his that says, "Since in the long run, every planetary civilization will be endangered by impacts from space, every surviving civilization is obliged to become spacefaring." That also brings us to the topic of disclosure, because I also heard you say that these visitors, these extraterrestrial beings, are waiting for us to become spacefaring in our civilization for them to reveal themselves and welcome in as their brothers and sisters. And also that when we have a better understanding of space and what spaceships are, that'll also advance us in our evolution. So where do we sit with that in terms of becoming spacefaring now in the present moment? Do you think that is a possibility that will eventually lead to more disclosure down the line?
Well, that really is the live question for 2024 because of all that's been disclosed in the last 12 months in the stoush between the Pentagon and members of Congress. And the argument has been over secrecy surrounding the program. Now, the program was publicly acknowledged by the Pentagon in 2019. And the program is the research and development program within the Pentagon to reverse engineer artifacts from UFO retrievals. Now, that may sound crazy, but that is what the Pentagon has authenticated publicly over the last 5 years. And so the agenda of the program is to develop spacefaring technology, to develop technology that can ping into someone else's planetary airspace in exactly the same way that our visitors ping into our airspace. So all that is happening right now. And what Hayam Eshed said, the Brigadier General I mentioned earlier, the Chief of Space Security of Israel for 28 years, he says that our visitors / overseers have agreed not to self-disclose until the program is not only successful, but publicly successful. The moment we learn how to manipulate space-time, which is what we really need to be able to do to travel interstellar distances, the moment we can manipulate space-time, we are truly spacefarers. We truly become neighbors of other spacefaring civilizations. And in that moment, our relationship will change. It will change from being the observed, the studied, the abducted, to being part of the Galactic Federation, or as Ed Mitchell used to call it, part of the community of spacefaring civilizations. So this policy of non-disclosure is sort of determined at two levels. Firstly, by our visitors who say they won't self-disclose until, but the until is dependent on our people not only reverse engineering the tech, but making public that we now have that technology. Now, according to Hayam Eshed, we are already in collaborations with visitors who have that tech. So in a sense, we have access to it. But until we can make it ours, until we know how to make it, until we know how to manipulate space-time for ourselves, we're waiting in this period of non-disclosure. And you mentioned Carl Sagan, who's an absolutely fascinating figure because many people know him for being an absolute skeptic about the
behind closed doors, not really.
The idea of contact, or the idea that we might have been engineered by extraterrestrial civilizations, adapted, might be the children of. Publicly, he was the true scientist and skeptic on that front. Until you read his novel, until you watch Contact, and he's putting forward something there that I think he believes very deeply, but didn't want to present as science. And that is precisely the idea that we are a daughter civilization of another civilization, and that we are under observation, and that we are in contact. Carl Sagan himself was involved in the process of non-disclosure in a rather interesting way. And that is that when, I don't know on how many missions he did this, but I know that on Ed Mitchell's mission, he was the 6th man to walk on the moon, just before the astronauts blasted off for their lunar mission, somebody poked their head round the door and said, if you have contact with visitors, here's the code word. And on one mission, the code word was grandma. And the other mission, I've forgotten what the word was, but it was Carl Sagan who said, you may meet people on the way there or on the way back or while you're there. Here's the code word. So he was actually involved in this pattern of non-disclosure for a long time. And at the beginning of his career in the 1960s, he argued exactly the same way that Erich Von Daniken did, that these ancient stories I've touched upon, in particular, the Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, and Assyrian stories, really were cultural memories of ET contact. And then later in his career, he went a bit quiet on that. But behind closed doors, I think that's really where his heart lay. I think that SETI, which was his project, was really the public face and the scientific way of saying we cannot possibly be alone, though he never quite went as far as perhaps Ed Mitchell did in saying, I'm sure we're in contact and we need some government openness about it.
Mm. And Paul, almost like it seems that from the beginning of time, these ancient texts are telling us that other beings have come to assist us as well. You look at the story of Sumeria, where all of a sudden civilization rose up from out of nowhere and we knew how to do agriculture, mathematics, very advanced level of thinking. That brings us to present day, where we're in a way, or these beings are waiting for us to become spacefaring by manipulating space and time. How come these benevolent beings don't just come in and tell humanity, hey, this is the formula, here's how you manipulate and warp space-time so you can be part of us? It seems like they're kind of just waiting, or do I have it the wrong way?
No, I think you're right. And I think that's a really good question. And you're quite right that when we look at major advances in the human story in the past, our ancestors had no problem with giving the credit for those things to non-human visitors. And so the most pervasive story around the world is of our great leap forward into agriculture. Because the moment you can cultivate crops and produce harvests, produce surpluses, now you're in a position to develop a specialized society. Now you can settle and build a city and become a civilization. So agriculture is absolutely key. And whether you're listening to Aboriginal Australians, Native American story, African story, Mesoamerican story, Sumerian story, ancient Hebrew story, the credit is given to visitors from the stars. So in the Hebrew tradition, that's the contribution of Asherah. In the story of the Philistines, it's the contribution of Dagon. In Mesoamerica, we hear of Hunhunapu. From the Zulu, we hear about Mbabwana Warisa. So there's this positive input. If you read the Book of Enoch, which is part of the canon of the Bible in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, it talks about a very rich cultural exchange from the Watchers, the Bene Elohim, the second wave of ET visitors. They came, not only did they teach agriculture, they taught metal technology, they taught people how to do their makeup and how to wear more interesting clothes. There was a really profound cultural exchange going on there that suggests a real affection, I think, for humanity. When you go to the story of Oannes and the Apkallu, you're listening to the Greek Babylonian explanation of our great leap forward into city building. So that story is really describing what happened to the ancestors of the Sumerians that meant that civilization could appear as if from nowhere. From a society of hunter-gatherers and foragers, all of a sudden we've got legal systems, money systems, courts, record keeping, literature, civil engineering. How do you get all those things in one hit? So now all of a sudden you can administrate a city. And the story of Oannes and the Apkallu is we were taught. We had non-human visitors who came and tutored us in all these things. And I think some of the most interesting leaps forward in the human story are to do with materials, science, the ability to light a fire and bake brick. Well, that's the great advance in the embedded in the Babel story. Or to cut stone, become a megalithic society. How do you do that? Or to work with metal. Right now, it's another leap forward in materials science that we're looking at. When we talk about manipulating space-time, it sounds very abstract. But when you get down and dirty with the physicists who are working on these things for the Pentagon's program, they are working on physical materials. They're working on reverse engineering what's called metamaterials. So these are the fabrics from which our visiting craft are constructed. This was the subject of the famous Wilson Davis note So that's Admiral Thomas Wilson and Eric Davis, the physicist who's doing the work today, along with Jacques Vallée and Gary Nolan. They have these materials which seem to have the ability to alter space-time and potentially create a space-time bubble. These are materials that are engineered outside of Earth's atmosphere in zero-G, materials that we have retrieved or perhaps been given so that we can have a play with, see if we can make them. And so there's actually more of a connection with the leaps forward of the past, learning how to build a fire, make brick, cut stone, manipulate metal. We're now manipulating these materials that will enable us to slip through the cosmos at what would seem to be impossible velocities.
I was having breakfast a couple of months ago with Billy Carson, and we were talking about ancient Egypt. We were talking about the pyramids, and Billy described to me how these pyramids were also in a way stargates. And you would look at the depictions that a lot of these, images of ancient Egypt, they showed this jed pillar, and how the jed pillar was an essential tool or artifact that these ancient cultures had to be able to travel out into the space or travel interdimensionally. What are your thoughts on ancient artifacts and things like the jed pillar that maybe we've lost through time?
Yes, that's fascinating territory. When we talk about artifacts like that, for most of us, it's an interesting idea, and that's all it is. But in the world of military intelligence, it is an interesting idea that they are willing to pour millions of dollars into. I mean, if we're talking about the program, we're talking about trillions of dollars. But if there is any hint of ancient technology on the planet, it is taken very seriously by the world of military intelligence. And so if we take the Allied incursion into Iraq in 2003, for instance, there are always many layers to any military incursion in any war. And of course, we had the public reasons for that war to save the Kurds from despotism and persecution, to save the world from weapons of mass destruction, to save Iraq from despotic leadership. So here's all the public reasons. Why else are we going? And on the one hand, within days of going into Iraq, there are archaeological missions going on to retrieve the sarcophagus of Gilgamesh, which allows us to fact test these ancient Sumerian stories of sky people, more of which perhaps later. But another reason we might be going there is back to the story of the Tower of Babel. If that was a Stargate, the Bible says it was in Iraq. So if there's any possibility, that there's any truth in that story, wouldn't you want to know, if you want the military advantage, the strategic advantage on planet Earth, even if it's only a possibility, you don't want ancient tech falling into the hands of your enemies. And I've come to believe that that's another reason we were there, to actually identify technology that might be there and sequester it if it existed, or if we couldn't remove it, turn it into a World Heritage Site so that no one can interfere with it. So these kinds of stories are interesting ideas to most of us, but they're actually very, very important in the world of military intelligence. And when I see that, it makes me take those stories all the more seriously.
And now we're talking about sort of technology outside of the human body. But when we look at the internal technology that we hold, we look at stories like Jesus. In other names, he was called Isa, the healer, and he had these capabilities to heal others. And I've gotten the opportunity to experience firsthand miracles. For example, going on retreats, Joe Dispenza retreats, I've seen people stand up from a wheelchair and walk again. And I'm looking there and I'm going, what is this inherent ability that we have to heal, and these sort of superpowers, which I'm fascinated by, the sixth sense? What do the ancients say, or what do biblical texts say about our internal spiritual technologies that we all have?
That's a wonderful question. I've experienced those things too, Emilio. And my first experience of those things was in a church context. And so I've seen people get up out of wheelchairs. There was a lady in the first church I ever went to who was healed of blindness in an eye that had no optic nerve. Well, that's a miracle if ever there was one. And so early in my spiritual journey, I interpreted this in a Christian way, and that is that God sometimes chooses to dispense gifts of healing to people, and that it's part of our job as the church to be conduits for that kind of grace. And so I learned to lay hands on people and speak to conditions and see things change. And I interpreted it in that way. I'm channeling the power of God here. But I hadn't been a believer for too long before I realized that things exactly like this happen in cultures all around the world, Christian and non-Christian, that experiences like this are had by people who were believers or non-believers. And so through the years, I had to come to terms with the fact that this is not just a Christian experience, this is a human experience. That there are ways that humans can interact with each other that create these inexplicable healing outcomes. And it was as I was still puzzling over that I started exploring the world of ancestral narratives, indigenous cultures, traditional initiation ceremonies, shamanic modalities, and again realized these abilities are human abilities that have been used and unlocked by all kinds of cultures. I learned pretty quickly that there is a very quick connection between this and the topic of paleocontact, because the cultures that have best curated their memories of ancient ET contact have also curated modalities to switch on higher cognitive abilities, because part of the paleocontact story is that our ancestors were smarter than we are today. This was one of the surprising things I learned as I followed the paleocontact story in the Bible, in the Mayan story of the Popol Vuh, in the African story from out of Nigeria of Abasi and Atai, in the Greek stories of the gods, Zeus and Prometheus. This pattern keeps repeating, and that is that our visitors adapted us and upgraded us until we were a useful sort of working class for them, upgraded us, and then, oh dear, the human beings are too capable.
We went too far.
Let's just dumb them down to the point where we can manage them. And I thought, what? All these stories describe this same shape, where the final step is a dumbing down. And if I go to the Mayan example, and then I'll compare it with the Nigerian example. In the Mayan story told in the Popol Vuh, the chief genetic engineer, Kukulkan, otherwise known as Quetzalcoatl or Cucumatz, his job is to produce these useful Homo sapiens. But he overshoots and he produces Homo sapiens, sapiens, sapiens. And that's us plus higher cognitive abilities. So better far sight, better future sight, better remote viewing, better telepathic connection, better self-healing abilities. This is described in quite a graphic way in the Mayan story. It talks of a time when our vision is not limited. And so if we think about how our vision is limited, we can't see through surfaces. We can't see into deep space. It's limited by distance. It's limited by frequency. We can only see this spectrum, not this spectrum. It's limited by time. We can only see the present, can't see the future, can't see the past. If our vision is not limited, then it means future viewing. It means past viewing. It means X-ray vision. It means seeing other frequencies. It means seeing other dimensions. And so the idea is there that our ancestors were more advanced, and then they were dumbed down. And in the Mayan story, they were dumbed down by a vapor that was sprayed in the atmosphere, that when it was sprayed over human populations would brain damage the humans to the point where we're limited to our 5 physical senses. We're only aware of what's right in front of us. And for anything else, we will have to depend on an authority telling us what's what. And the authorities, the feathered serpents, found they could work with that.
Do we know what substance that spray is made of, or?
No, we don't. The ancient Hawaiian story of the Mo'o tells a very similar story, and it says that what the ancient dragons did was to lower the oxygen content in the atmosphere, and that brain damaged us, that dumbed us down. So that's an interesting correlation. You go to the Nigerian story, and it's a little vaguer, but again, it reaches the point where the powerful beings, the advanced beings, Abasi and Atai, they've gone on holiday after engineering Homo sapiens. They've come back, and we're now too advanced. And so they release devices into the environment to make us ill and distressed, mentally ill, because now they find they can manipulate us and manage us. Now, these are awful stories. There's no reason to invent these stories. It doesn't glorify the gods, the kings, or the general public. There's no reason to invent it. But there is a positive take-home from the stories, because that dumbing down wasn't an alteration of our potential, wasn't an alteration of our DNA. It's put something in the environment. Mm-hmm. And so the silver lining of that is that if you can get your environment clean, and your air clean, and your water clean, and your food supply clean, your higher cognitive abilities will start firing off again. And sure enough, if you do any of these shamanic ceremonies around the world that are designed to switch higher faculties back on, you will have to clean up your diet for a week or 2 before you do the initiation. So even if you live in a place where the food is probably fairly organic, fairly clean, you still have to do that cleanup first. And so it's built into these shamanic protocols, this ancient knowledge about the environment and the importance of getting it clean. So I find that very interesting. And you mentioned acquired savant syndrome earlier, because there's real science attached to this. The idea that you and I have higher cognitive abilities waiting to be tapped, waiting to be switched on, that's something we are discovering through real neuroscience around the world. And acquired savant syndrome is a real-world phenomenon in which people suddenly have higher cognitive abilities knocked on by accident. So they'll have a head trauma, central nervous system event, an accident, a stroke, and then or go into a coma. And then when they emerge from that, they can speak a language they couldn't speak before. They've got advanced knowledge of physics. Their mathematical skills are absolutely prodigious. They can play a musical instrument. Their artistic performance is off the scale. And these neuroscientists are asking the obvious question, what are advanced cognitive powers doing in our brains in the off position that runs against everything we think we know about the evolution of human beings? But these ancestral stories of our engineering have an explanation. Might be a mind-boggling one, but they have an explanation that fits. And that is, we all have these abilities, but there's stuff in the environment preventing these parts of our brains from working. So I find the correlation between the modern science and the ancient story absolutely fascinating.
And going again back to ancient Sumeria and the tablets, in that story, Enki was responsible for this genetic engineering. And when it got we got too smart and there was a dumbing down, it was also described there was a huge flood, a deluge on planet Earth, and everything was wiped out except for a couple maybe, and Lil whispered in someone's ear, go save yourself, and built a ship around you and all your family and a couple animals. What happened in that story of the Great Flood, and how come as we're beginning to tap into these abilities now, we're not seeing any major catastrophes happen yet?
Yes, that's a great question. The flood is probably one of the first stories that people begin to recognize as a global story. So I first learned about the flood through the Christian tradition, being taught about Noah's Ark at school. And then I later learned, oh, there's a Sumerian version of this. There's a Babylonian and Akkadian version of this story. And then there's a Chinese version of it and an Australian version. In the Enki and Enlil story, the Sumerian story, the flood is a matter of some conflict among the governing powers. So Enlil, who is the space captain, we can call him, he's responsible for this region of space. He's not very into Project Humanity. Enki is the genetic engineer who's produced Homo sapiens. And so when Enlil comes along and says, we need a cull, there are just too many of these human beings around, he is able to carry the counsel. Enki is the one who's not happy about that because he's formed an attachment to Homo sapiens. And it's actually Enki who goes and warns Noah, aka Zusudra, aka Archdeacon, aka Utnapishtim, to construct this capsule that will preserve 5 human bloodlines and the animals off his farm as well. And what's interesting about that family of stories, the Archdeacon, Zusudra, Utnapishtim, Noah stories, is that the detail of that escape capsule, the Ark, recurs from culture to culture across centuries, across the ages, with phenomenal precision. So you get the volume of this craft from the Sumerian story, and then read the volume of Noah's craft in Genesis. These massive craft, their volumes vary by no more than 4% from culture to culture. This is absolutely amazing. And I mentioned, I think, in Escaping from Eden, that the shape of it even is remembered, is carried in cultural memory in a way that is hard to explain, because so many of us grew up on the biblical story of Noah, and yet we picture the coracle of Archdeacon when we picture the Ark. It's this sort of rounded shaped boat with a little sort of hut on the top. That is the coracle of Archdeacon. The instructions in the Bible describe a cuboid. So how come we've got this other shape in our minds when most of us have never read the Epic of Gilgamesh? We've never read the Sumerian stories. Maybe we've never even heard of the Mesopotamian cuneiforms. And yet the shape described by those ancient extinct cultures has persisted in our minds. So you're asking, why isn't there a catastrophe right now? That's a very good question. Plato believed that catastrophes at that level happen every 5,000 years or so, and that they're actually caused by the movement of objects through space, that they are natural cataclysms. Those objects could be meteors or asteroids, could be the movement of planets that come close, or moons that get captured by a gravity and then they cause catastrophes on the planet's surface, could be caused by solar flares. But Plato had the idea it was fairly regular. And if he's right, then actually we are due for something else fairly major. My hope is that we've got enough tech represented by our visitors, by the Galactic Federation, that we might be able to deflect something coming our way next time. But I guess we'll have to wait and see.
We'll have to wait and see. And you mentioned Noah, or another text, Ziusudra, and how Enki grew this fascination with humanity and sort of whispered into Noah's ear, like, there's something big coming. Was Noah, was he a hybrid? Or why did Enki have such a close relationship with this human in specific, or with Noah in specific?
Oh, that's a fascinating question. There are hints of Noah being a hybrid. But then if you think about it, all of humanity is hybrid by that point. And in the biblical story, and it's a motif that repeats in other cultures, the reason for the famous flood was because of hybridization that had happened that was not authorized, that had breached a non-involvement agreement by the powers. But human beings are hybrids. This is the conclusion I've come to. We are earthlings. We are life forms that have developed here, but we have been adapted by visitors in the past, which is why we're now so ill-adapted to planet Earth. It's why you and I, if we were left in the wilderness, probably after 3 days, 3 nights, would either be deceased or pretty sick. The only way we're going to be able to survive is if we can light a fire, build a shelter, make a weapon. So the only way we can become an alpha species here is through technology. So where does that suddenly come from? And how do we survive in all the ages when we're trying to develop technology? There's something ill-fitting about that story. And what exactly are we? Are we omnivores? Are we carnivores? I mean, if you look at the other carnivores on planet Earth, do they have to cook their food before they eat it so they don't get poisoned by all the earth foods? There's something about us that is very ill-fitting, and the ancients have an explanation that we are earthlings, but we're a little bit of ET as well. And of course, you have that motif in the Bible, let us make them to look like us. And so all of a sudden, we're the only primates without hair. So my guess is our engineers didn't have hair. We look a little bit more like them. And so I can't remember your original question here. Remind me.
I'm still waiting for my beer to come in, so...
Yes.
Was Noah a hybrid?
Was Noah a hybrid? Yes, but so are we all.
Kind of. What do you believe that Jesus knew about humanity while he was here on earth?
Oh, yes. I think what Jesus knew is key to his genius, and is really a key part of the mystery that surrounds him. Once you recognize the paleocontact narratives in the Hebrew scriptures, you have to ask, did Jesus know that? Or was he so much a person of his generation that he believed what he was brought up to believe and then was able to transcend that belief somehow? Or does he know everything we know about the ancient Sumerians, Babylonians, Akkadians, and Assyrians? Did he know that those God stories are based on the story of something else? And I think it's difficult to answer definitively, but what I would say is this, that Jesus does not identify himself with the Yahweh stories and with Yahwistic law. He distances himself from those things. So you read the Gospel of Matthew, and he is a counterpart to Yahweh. You've heard it said in the past, I say this. Moses told you this, I say this. In the law it says this, but I say this. Jesus is presenting an alternative way to the way of Yahweh. And then he makes some odd references to Yahweh that make it sound like he doesn't have a high opinion of him at all. So he says in one place, it's Matthew 6, Luke 11. What kind of father, if their children asked for food or drink, would give them a stone or would give them serpents? And it sounds random to us when he says that, but his original audience knew exactly what he was talking about. And that was the moment when the children of Israel are starving in the desert. Yahweh's provided them with emergency rations of something they don't even know what it is. Manna means we don't know what it is. They've got fed up of it and they're complaining. They want proper food. And Yahweh gives them a stone for water and snakes as punishment. And Jesus is really saying, what kind of father does that? You evil lot wouldn't do that to your kids, he says, would you? And so he's really striking at the heart of the idea that Yahweh is any kind of God or father. And then in John's gospel, he's talking to the Jewish leaders and he speaks about your father, the devil, who was a liar and a murderer and a liar from the beginning, the father of all lies. Well, who can he possibly be talking about? And then when Jesus talks about God, never once does he use the word Yahweh for God. He uses the Greek word, theos. And the meaning of theos is given for us in a beautiful way by the Apostle Paul in Acts 17. He's speaking to a non-religious audience, a non-Jewish audience. And he says, by theos, I mean the source of the cosmos and everything in it, that in which we all live and move and have our being, of which we're all offspring, which is a beautiful vision of God. It's a vision of no separation, where you can't put a piece of paper between me and theos, the source, where the idea is that my consciousness is a participation in source consciousness. My intelligence is an emanation of source intelligence, where I should fully expect to be thinking divine thoughts, having divine experiences, where there's no separation. So I love that quote from Paul. That's what theos means. And when Jesus talks about God, he talks about theos, who he addresses as pater, father, or in the Lord's Prayer, Father, the one being in the heavens, just to clarify, and then whom he addresses as Abba. That's Jesus' language for God. Never once do we hear the word Yahweh on his lips. And by the time the early church are thinking through the implications of that, they are realizing Jesus was not a Yahwist, didn't teach Yahwism, and that Christianity wasn't going to be built on Yahwism. And so in Acts 15, they hold a meeting clarifying that decision for the church from that time to this. Colossians 2:14 talks about the written code having been cancelled. So in that sense, I think Jesus knew Yahweh was not God. I think it's possible that Jesus knew as much international thought as those who wrote for him. And they knew Plato like the back of their hands. And Plato's worldview is that we are earthlings, but we've been visited by powerful others who've done terraforming and who've adapted us, made us more intelligent, more conscious. The early church fathers had no problem with any of that belief. They didn't see that as being in any way in conflict with what they saw and heard in Jesus. So it's not a definitive answer to whether Jesus was into paleocontact. My suspicion is he knew at least as much as I do on this topic.
Mm. Where does reincarnation fit into all of this? Because I've seen a couple of your videos on the series of Jesus and the lost years, where he went. Was he in India? And of course, in Hinduism, a lot of that is around the reincarnation concept. So you would imagine if Jesus was in India getting taught by the masters over there, then he would have a notion of what reincarnation was. Do the ancient texts mirror this belief in many lives and reincarnation coming back once again, and karma, all of these ideas that are fascinating?
Yes. I mean, personally, I am leaning to the view that Jesus did visit India, and that was part of where he got his wisdom from. It's not proven. I think it would be very difficult to prove that. But then all narratives around Jesus are just that, narratives. There is no archaeological evidence you could point to if Jesus was here or not here. But the ideas of reincarnation had certainly traveled as far as the Middle East from India, and they were part of public thinking, public conversation at the time of Jesus. So much so that when Jesus asks his disciples in the Gospels, "Who do people think I am?" one of the answers is, "Oh, they think you are a reincarnation of one of the prophets." Some thought he was a reincarnation of John the Baptist, which doesn't quite work because their timelines overlapped. But those answers show that reincarnation was part of the thought life of the people at the time of Jesus. Now, as a young Christian, I believed there was a fundamental incompatibility between being a Christian and believing in reincarnation. The early church fathers didn't take that view at all, and you can go to Origen and Clement of Alexandria, and they put forward tentatively the idea of reincarnation. It was in the air because Plato had put it forward tentatively as well. Now, he was a great scholar of world wisdom, of international thought, and he makes a bit of a case that we are primarily beings of consciousness, and hints at the possibility that after this material life, we might have another material life, Or we might go on to a completely different experience for further learning, because his whole idea is that our experience of life is a learning journey. In the New Testament, there is a verse which, as a young believer, I thought ruled this out. And it's a verse that's often used by people when they want to terrify their audience into becoming Christians to avoid hell. And if I remember correctly, it's 1 Thessalonians 2 verses 8 and 9 that say it is destined for man to die once and afterwards face judgment. Now we hear those words, we hear the word judgment, and we immediately think, oh dear me, this is the doctrine of hell for the unbeliever. It's not what the word says. You go to the root meaning, and you could equally translate it as assessment. Destined for man to die and afterward the assessment. Well, Plato believed in a life review. He believed that when we die, we are visited by spirits whose job is to help us process what has just happened to us in our earthly life and help us through the process of transitioning. This is the life review. Judgment, the core word, the root meaning of the word could mean exactly that. And then I discover, when I go to the Greek, there's an invention in the translation. It is destined for man to die once and afterwards face a life review. The once isn't in the Greek. All it actually says in the Greek is that every one of us dies and then faces a life review. And that has been upgraded into this terrifying doctrine of judgment and hell for the non-believer, which is not in the text. And if I now use the root meanings and say every one of us dies and then faces a life review, that doesn't rule out reincarnation, does it? In fact, it's part of the reincarnation story. So like Origen, like Clement of Alexandria, I believe it's possible. I can see it making sense. I wouldn't teach it as a dogma. I wouldn't say that people have to believe it. But I think it's possible. It makes sense to me.
And for me, coming from a Latin American family, we would say, okay, we're Catholic, but I had a very different upbringing in the sense of many people because religion was never pushed onto me. So you can imagine someone that is coming to these ideas right now without any of the biases previously of, God is an angry God. He will punish you. Even though I did have some of that because I would talk to my friends that were religious and I'd ask them, like, what is God? Like, what is all that stuff? Oh, no, you have to do this right. You can't do this and that. And today I was just curious because I heard you speaking about Moses and the 10 Commandments. And I had never really sat down with them and just explored them. And some of them made sense to me, right? Thou shalt not steal from thy neighbor. But then I came across ones where like, thou shalt not have no other gods. You shall not make idols. And I'm looking at humanity. I'm like, well, different humans, different cultures have different gods. So that's one commandment. You shall not make idols. We make idols out of anything nowadays. We make idols out of movie stars, artists, all of these different things outside of us. So who influenced Moses to write these commandments and why?
Yes, indeed. Well, it's interesting because, earlier I said that Jesus never once uses the word Yahweh. There is a moment when he quotes Yahweh's 10 commandments. A young man has said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says to him, well, you know the law. And he rattles off the 10 commandments, but misses out the first ones that talk about Yahweh and the Elohim. Doesn't mention them at all. It's a bit of a smoking gun. And those first two do identify these 10 commandments with Yahweh as the lawgiver. So Yahweh, as I said before, he's a junior Elohim. And I say junior because when El Elyon, the leader of the El Ba'adat, divides up the lands and apportions them to different Elohim, so each territory has its own Elohim, Yahweh gets short shrift. He gets a people group with no land. And so his first job is to go and get his people group, the tribes of Israel, off another Elohim and out of that Elohim's land. So that's Achech of Egypt. And then he gets those people and then he must govern over them. So he must make laws by which they are governed and then create a priesthood who will police those laws. And so the Ten Commandments are part of those laws. Now, they make very good moral sense, and most cultures live essentially by those principles, except for the ones that talk about Yahweh and the other Elohim, where he says, I'm your Elohim, you must have no allegiance to any other Elohim. In fact, you're not even allowed to depict them, let alone bow down to them. And what he says there reflects an ancient world of henotheism, an idea where there are many gods, but I'm the God you are going to worship. So it's an acknowledgement of these other Elohims. So no longer can you translate Elohim as God. It is powerful beings in the plural. And we see that Yahweh is in competition with these other Elohim. He has to go to war with the other Elohim to get land and resources. They go to war with each other for land and resources. He's got this crazy jealous relationship with the Elohim of Ekron and gets furious when his own king consults the powerful one of Ekron for a medical prognosis. So the plurality is affirmed there by the Ten Commandments. It's echoed by Joshua, who is Moses' successor. Moses gets the law. Joshua is the successor. And he says to his people, you need to choose who you're going to work for. Are you going to work for Yahweh, or are you going to work for the other Elohim? Again, as if they are equivalent entities. He says, don't serve Achech of Egypt. Serve Yahweh, our powerful one. The names are so similar and the service is equivalent that tells you Yahweh is one of this community of beings. Are you going to serve the powerful ones our ancestors served in Mesopotamia, he says, on the other side of the river? He's talking about Abraham and his ancestors. So the Ten Commandments is part of a whole matrix of texts that reminds us of a time when our planet was occupied by a whole number of Elohim, a whole number of powerful ones. And then there's a process of suppression, because Yahweh says, I don't want you to even depict them. I want you to forget what they look like. Forget they ever existed. And that process of suppression continues through the Bible, so that a later Yahwist king, Hezekiah, sends his troops into the temple to deface all the carvings showing what the other Elohim looked like. And there's a little hint there that he even wants the depiction of Yahweh defaced as well. I think the story is defaced by accident, but I actually think it was all part of the same action. He didn't want people to remember what Yahweh looked like because it would be too terrifying and wouldn't look like God Almighty. He would look like all the other Elohim of the Tzeva HaShamayim. And so the carvings are destroyed in the Jerusalem temple. The other temples are demolished. The other priesthoods are disbanded. Never mind, they'd all been commissioned by kings of Israel who knew about paleocontact, kings and queens of Israel who remembered Chemosh, who remembered Milcom, who remembered Asherah, and wanted to honor their contribution to the human story. But no, under the Yahwist king Hezekiah, it all has to be obliterated. And we really see the seeds of that cultural obliteration in the Ten Commandments themselves.
And you mentioned a key word in that bit, which was eternal life. And that also brings us to the Epic of Gilgamesh, because there was a point in that story where he went seeking eternal life as well. And what happened to him?
Yes, that's right. I think behind that is the difference between the governed human beings and the governing sky people. If you look at the ages of beings in the Bible, there are some very anomalous ages. And if you go to the King's List of ancient Sumer, you'll find some anomalous ages. And if you take the King's List at face value, you've got dates for all these reigns from the pre-Diluvian past up until the recent past by Sumerian standards. And in the recent past, you've got human kings with human lifespans, with human reigns. And then you go back and you've got a 241,000-year period presided over by only 8 successive kings contiguously. So how long do they live exactly? And I think
thousands of years.
Yes, thousands of years. So comparing the lifespan of an Elohim or a sky person with the lifespan of a human being would be like comparing our lifespans with that of an ant. And so clearly the human perspective is that these are eternal beings we're looking at. And so mythology grew up around these being eternal beings, that they could not be killed, they could not be destroyed, that they were almost elemental beings. And so I wonder if that's where our ideas of eternal life came from at one level. At another level, I think eternal life could be a reality when we ask who and what we are at a more profound level. So I mentioned Plato earlier and his idea that we are fundamentally beings of consciousness and that we exist as beings of consciousness before we come into this material life. And we have this material experience to have experiences and learn things. And then we move on to another experience afterwards. And I think there's been some interesting research done around near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, that I think support the idea that we are beings of consciousness hosted by our physical bodies, that our consciousness is not the function of a body, it's not the product of a body. It is something that is hosted and processed by the body. That was Plato's belief. And I think what I love about that is that I think it enables me to go at life more courageously. If my purpose here is to have experiences and to learn things, well, I want to do that. I want to ace that. Whereas with the old worldview of this implacable God whom you mustn't displease for fear of an eternity in torment, now you're tiptoeing around trying all the time not to do the wrong thing, not to fall off the tightrope. And that's a totally disempowering way of going about life. And when I put Jesus into that matrix, I find that he is one who is there to empower us, and his invitations are to explore. And when the canonical Gospels and the Gospel of Thomas says the kingdom of heaven, which you could translate as the cosmic realm, is inside you, well, that's an invitation to explore the inner space. And his first sermon in the Gospel of Matthew, you go to the root meanings of the key words. Kingdom of heaven could be translated cosmic realm. He says the cosmic realm is available to you, is at hand. And that's an invitation to explore the cosmos, to explore this life, to explore what's possible for us. And so I think the idea that we are eternal beings, having a material experience, to have experiences and learn things, I find it empowering. I find it better than the old narrative of be obedient and don't put a foot wrong and then you go to heaven.
And Paul, to really bring it home for people, I would love to get your take on what is the new story of humanity that is emerging right now, and what was it that our ancestors really wanted us to know?
Well, our ancestors certainly wanted us to know that we are citizens of the cosmos, that we're part of a wider cosmic family, that we are capable of more than we're currently experiencing, that our ancestors had higher cognitive abilities, and that we can too. That if we learn love and harmony and solidarity, that we can affect profound social change as we experience this life. That as we explore our cognitive abilities, we can improve each other's experiences in terms of healing, emotional healing, psychological healing, becoming more emotionally intelligent. They also wanted us to know that we live in a soup of cosmic company. And if you go to any traditional healing practitioner, that is the basis of any protocol they're going to follow. That you and I each have an invisible team of helpers to support.
We brought them all in today.
Support our material experience. That's actually hinted at in the Bible itself, in the New Testament, in 1 John 4. The writer there says we should all expect to get good information from spirits. And he never says exactly what these beings are or where they're from. More important, he says, is you keep your sovereignty. Don't believe everything you hear. Don't do everything you're told. Weigh it up for yourself. You're a sovereign being. And if you're willing to do that, you're going to get some good information. And so we're on a learning journey. We're on a journey of expansion. We are on a journey of learning what it can mean to be a human being and a human society, knowing it can be better than everything we've achieved to date, and knowing that we have cosmic support in achieving it.
And brother, we end every podcast with a segment called the Final Trio, which are final questions. A couple are customized, personalized to the guests, and then the final one we ask at the end of every show. Before that, I know people are going to want to connect with you even further. Where would you send them to acquire the books, the documentaries that you've been making, all the beautiful projects that are around you? Where would you send people to connect with that?
Well, for my books, that's Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden, Echoes of Eden, The Eden Conspiracy, and in April, The Invasion of Eden. Go to Amazon and Kindle. The first two you can find wherever books are sold, and the remainder you can find on Amazon. You can go to fifthkind.tv if you want to support the work I do. You can find me on YouTube on the Paul Wallis Channel and the Fifth Kind. And if you want to keep up with my work, come to my website. You can communicate with me through my website, which is paulanthonywallis.com.
Perfect, brother. Thank you. We'll link everything in the show notes. And for the final trio, the first one, I want to take you back to your ultimate Frisbee injury that made you stay put and at home for a little while and really go deep into all these texts. And you didn't have to think about going and giving a sermon and regurgitating information that you had read before. You got to really experience this text on your own that then led you to an adventure outside in the world. So if you were to create or give a sermon today, what would you call it and what would it be about?
I'm glad you brought me back to that, because my ultimate Frisbee injury was a great gift. Having that period between pastorates where I could just follow my own curiosity was a great gift. And I think to enable me to do that, it comes back to what I was saying before about a clean environment, because I really took the opportunity to get my diet as good as it could be, to get out into nature, to breathe deeply every day, to get sunlight on my skin every day, to walk in the forest every day. And I think it was because I did those things and recalibrated in that way that I was able to learn new things and make a new journey, detoxify in all kinds of ways. And I think if you can do that, and if you can help others do that, I mean, if you have friends who are just super stressed, can you gift them a weekend? Can you gift them a holiday? Can you give them some mortgage relief? Can you give them a gift that will help them get into a space where they can just relax and be their creative selves and read a book? I think if we can maintain that kind of space for ourselves and for each other, that's when we have the potential to make new journeys and make new discoveries. And so I would want to encourage people to do that without needing an injury to force them into a place of rehabilitation. Not everyone has to have an ultimate Frisbee injury. Let's gift that kind of time to each other so that we have the space for that kind of growth.
So the sermon would be something around solitude, following your own curiosity, and cleaning up your environment. Beautiful.
It would. And it doesn't have to be absolute solitude. I was really blessed that my wife made a similar journey to mine at the same time, not through doing studies of Hebrew texts or going for walks in the bush, but in entirely her own way. And so it is a journey you can make with others. But I think having that time to get into that sort of freewheeling, relaxed, playful frame of mind. I think that's the real key.
I love that. For the second question, what is your relationship with God now?
My relationship with God, I enjoy so much more than I have done in the past, because in the past it was that tightrope vision of must do his will, mustn't do the wrong thing, must find out what he wants. Of course, God, as I understood him, makes it really difficult to find out what he wants, but you still got to get that right somehow. Now, I think that definition of God I mentioned from the Apostle Paul earlier, the source in which we all live and move and have our being, I find that really empowering, so that now in my prayer life, if I have a question, God, how can I do this? How can I do this better? Or what should I do here? I fully expect an answer to come almost immediately, either through my own thoughts or through a whole cosmos of resources. Might come through a song on the radio, might come through something that my child says, something that an animal does. But I have that strong a sense of being enmeshed with God, the source, that I believe I'm going to go through life with divine resources. And so my relationship with God is more confident and less anxious than it's been in the past. And I find sort of evidences for being surrounded by divine wisdom on a daily basis in a way that is much more pervasive, I think, than my experience of God in the past.
And I think that's the true meaning of faith. Beautiful. This final question is about your legacy for the next generation of leaders. We call it the time capsule question, and it requires us to move out into the future around 15 to 20 years down the line. And I chose out that time period because I feel like that is when the next generations, the young generations now, are going to be stepping into leadership positions around the world. They're going to be the leaders of the churches. They're going to be the leaders of the new systems, economic systems, education systems, spiritual leaders, anything. But these leaders are going to want some guidance. They're going to want some wisdom. And you were given the opportunity to create a time capsule and leave behind a time capsule for them. And in this time capsule, you can include anything that you wanted. It can be, doesn't even have to be physical. It could be non-physical, and something like an energy, a frequency, a vibration, a transmission if you want. But really beyond your imagination, what you would include in this time capsule, so that when these leaders go to it and they open it, they will be equipped with the resources that they'll need to usher in the new epoch that we're headed to. What would you include inside of this time capsule?
Well, I hope this isn't a boring answer, but I'd put all my books in that capsule.
Yes.
And I hope that what people would find in the books is, firstly, a sense of joy and playfulness as I traverse this territory, as I go through all the kind of material we've been discussing today, so that they will enjoy the learning journey and have that sense of joy and courage in learning new things for themselves. And I'd want them to have the information that our ancestors bequeathed to us. I'd want people to know we are cosmic beings, that we are capable of more, that we're part of a wider cosmic family, that we have cosmic support, that every one of us has an invisible team of helpers wanting us to ace this human experience. And knowing that contact with cosmic neighbors is not the job of the higher ups exclusively. It's not a conversation that we leave to the Pentagon and the leaders of aerospace working on the program. Contact is for humanity. And we want to experience contact in a way that advances the human story. And so to encourage people in the future to pursue that contact for themselves at a grassroots level, knowing that when we find each other in love and solidarity, we can make amazing things happen. And so I hope that optimism and that courage and that exploration is something that will be sparked by anyone picking up that capsule 15, 20, 150 years from now.
Mm-hmm. And on top of the time capsule, there's a gold plate with your name on it, and you could leave behind a question for these leaders, a contemplative, reflective question for them to to ponder upon and think about, what would it be?
I might put a question like, so what do you think is going on? Because I think whoever they are, whatever society they're living in, there will be something going on in the world around them that will clue them to a bigger picture. And then what they've noticed in their immediate world is going to take them to other worlds, worlds of the past, other worlds of the cosmos. But I think everyone spots anomalies or wonders, why did that just happen? So I think a question like that, so what do you think is going on? Everyone has their own curiosity. Everyone has some white rabbit in their life, and all they need to do is follow it.
Neo from the Matrix, brother. Thank you for being a lighthouse. Thank you for activating your inner savant and really bringing all this information for humanity in service and in love. So I appreciate you. I would love to continue our conversations, brother, in this friendship. And overall, just from the bottom of our heart, thank you for the service that you're doing, and may you continue to thrive and find the truth that humanity needs right now.
Thanks, Emilio. It's been a real pleasure.
You too, brother.